All right. Make sure that I am, in fact, recording. All right. Okay, so hopefully I haven't had a chance to grade it yet, but hopefully a lot of you did that section 2. And we're actually going to look at one part of that now, and that is there were a lot of problems, but essentially industrialization had to be a big benefit, or it wouldn't have spread. Right. So today we're talking about industrialization going all around the world. But what happens? The reason why is they see the positive effects that has on Britain. Okay, and they want to do the same thing. All right. So what are the immediate benefits? The immediate good things about switching to an industrialized economy? Well, a lot of job growth, okay, low unemployment. The nation becomes richer and more powerful than its rivals, and we get technological progress. If you look back at 6.1, we had the spinning jenny, and then we had the power loom, the flying shuttle. People kept inventing newer and better ways to make things through the private competition of industry. And so the nation gets richer, it gets more technologically advanced, and as a result of that, we get improvements in a lot of things. Okay, you're going to see gradually education will improve and public education will be established, which I know you're enjoying. And then goods will become cheaper. Regular people will be able to afford clothing, eventually better housing, better food will be available, an overall higher standard of living. Like, for example, it wasn't until after the Industrial Revolution that common people like us could wear underwear. All right. When clothes were all handmade, people were too poor to wear a whole set of clothes under their clothes. So you would just wear one set of clothes until it pretty much rotted off your body, and then you would have new clothes made. But with industrialization and affordable textiles, people start to wear underwear underneath their clothes. And eventually, and we'll talk more about this on, what's today? Today's Wednesday. We'll talk more about it on Friday. The conditions in industrialization for the first 50 years or so are really harsh. And then gradually, the workers begin to win better conditions, shorter hours, higher pay, things like that we'll talk about on Friday. And then there's the long-term benefits. We're still living the long-term benefits today. Like I said back in the beginning, we're surrounded by stuff made by the industrial processes, right? All this wonderful stuff we have, all the technology, the clothing, the furnishings in our home, all of that we're able to afford because it's made cheaply in factories, right? And so we have better living and better working conditions today. They're constantly improving, hopefully. And then more industry meant a bigger tax base for the governments, and the governments use that tax base to improve cities. We're going to talk about that a little bit too, but those early industrial cities like Manchester that you looked at, had open sewers and no policing, and they didn't have street lights and things, and they were not nice to live in. But gradually, the governments took tax money and paved the streets and made formal sewers, made public education, okay, and in some countries, public health care. And so we get cities improving, as well as working conditions and living conditions. All right. And so the rest of the world, especially Western Europe and the US, look at Britain and they say, well, that's what we want to do. And so we'll look in particular at the United States for reasons which hopefully are obvious. But the United States is going to want to copy what Britain is doing. And it has just as many advantages, if not more, than Britain does, right? We have coal, we have iron, we have navigable waterways, we have a tremendous amount of land. Okay, we have all of those advantages that we saw Britain have in the first section of chapter 9. And now Britain knows this. Britain knows that all the other nations want to copy what they've achieved in industry, and they don't want that to happen. So people with skill, like inventors, machine operators, draftsmen, managers, things like that, they're basically not allowed to leave England anymore because they don't want people taking this knowledge with them, building new factories in other countries. And those who are allowed to leave generally are workers and even people who operate the machines. Before they would be allowed to leave Britain, they'd have their luggage searched to make sure they're not smuggling out plans and blueprints for these machines. So one man gets around that. Okay? His name is Samuel Slater. This is him right here. And he memorized the entire design of every part of his textile machine so that they couldn't search him for that, right? So he memorizes how to build one of these machines, goes to the United States and builds one and establishes the first modern textile mill in the United States. And eventually, in a place called Lowell, Massachusetts, it's sort of like the Manchester of the United States, at least early on. You have a lot of excess labor, right? We have basically the daughters of farmers who aren't needed to work the farm, but the family still needs income. They go and they work at these mills, and they begin to produce large amounts of textiles, like in Britain. And then that's going to continue spreading. And then across the country now, there's plenty. One thing we have a lot more than Britain of is land. So we get manufacturing towns. Many of them eventually grow into cities. They spring up all over the country. And as I said, our first labor source is young single women. They flock to factory towns. They work in the textile mills because their labor is no longer needed on the farm because we've had the agricultural revolution. And even as late as, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, this is how Walmart started. Walmart, Sam Walton would build department stores in remote country towns, and his workforce would be female farm residents who wouldn't have any other means of employment. And so they'd work at Walmart, and they'd work pretty cheaply. And also, it's a place where people in the countryside could go and get a lot of the goods that they didn't have access to. And that's why Walmart became so successful. And then gradually moved into cities and things. All right, but finding a way to use that excess labor in the countryside can make you rich. And then we're going to get pretty quickly in the United States companies like Levi Strauss that will make finished clothing that you can go and buy, a pair of pants or a shirt. And we're going to get shoes made by machines. So shoes will become much cheaper. And again, like early clothing, you won't have to just have one pair of shoes and wear them until they fall off your feet. You'll be able to afford 2 or 3 or even more pairs of shoes because they're cheaper, because they're made on a machine. So some other key developments. The Civil War, which hopefully you remember from middle school. After the Civil War, we have a huge industrial boom in the United States that you're going to see in this graph we're going to look at. And essentially, the North is very industrialized, but that's going to spread to the Midwest. And we're going to get lots of new technologies, right? Things like the telegraph. We'll also have the locomotive. Eventually, we're going to have large mechanized farming equipment. We're going to have all sorts of new, wonderful things. And this goes to what we talked about a couple weeks ago. This is now starting to be the time period where a lot of stuff will change during your lifetime, and things will be very different when you're an old man or a woman from when you were a kid, right? For most of human history, everything stayed the same for your whole life. But now we're getting technology picking up. We're getting things like the typewriter, ultimately the phonograph, the radio. We're getting a lot of stuff that you'll recognize as part of your life. And other cities, especially Chicago is the most famous example. Because it's located on where the rail lines eventually go, it becomes one of the major centers in the U.S. And one of the first industries it has is all of this livestock, beef and pork and chicken can be shipped to the slaughterhouses in Chicago. And then on an industrial scale, the animals are slaughtered and butchered, and the different products go out to the rest of the world. They're going to invent the refrigerated train car so that they'll be able to actually freeze steaks and chicken and stuff the way we buy it now and keep it frozen and ship it from Chicago all over the country. And a man named Clarence Birdseye will do the same thing with produce. Okay, that's still a brand of frozen vegetables you can buy. And so we get what they're called reefer cars filled with products going from Chicago and other major cities out to the whole country, right? And people start buying frozen food. And then as this all happens, small companies sometimes either willfully merge with another company to become a bigger company that can have more customers and meet its customers' needs better and make more money. Sometimes small companies are just bought out by a bigger company. And that's what's going to happen to some of you who are your own boss. Your company will be very successful, and someone will say, hey, I'd like to buy your company. And you'll decide either, yeah, I'm ready to move on, and you'll sell your company and hopefully have a lot of money, and then you can move on to something else. Some people sell their companies and keep working for the company that bought their company. There's all different types of ways that can go. All right, so small companies become larger companies. And if you look, you guys see this mostly with media, right? Anything that's successful, Google or Amazon will try to buy it, right? Whether it's Instagram, Snapchat, or Facebook will try to buy it, because anything that could compete with them, they want to own it, so it's not going to compete with them. And then usually they plug that technology in to their overall products. Like all Google used to be was a search engine, and now their telephones, operating systems, artificial intelligence, server farms, all kinds of things, all right? Because they're acquiring smaller companies that specialize in that stuff, and they're becoming one giant, huge company. And we're going to get a new type of company, which is really important to your life, whether you know it or not. And that's something called a corporation. Now, a corporation is something different than just a big, big company. Right here you see a share of stock for the Coca-Cola company. All right. A corporation has a lot of advantages over a privately owned company. The key advantage is that you can sell stock. And essentially, a corporation, when you incorporate, like if you were to take your business and turn it into a corporation in the state of California, it legally becomes a person. Your corporation has the same standing as a human being in the courts. So your corporation can sue for people. Its property has to be protected. It has rights, just like a person. And the reason people form corporations is two reasons. Number one, when you work really hard and build your whole business, if you pass away, well, you will pass away. But when you die, what's going to happen? All right, who's going to take it over? Are your kids going to run it? Could be all sorts of things. If you incorporate, the corporation lives forever. And so your business will live on after you do. And then secondly, there's what's called limited liability. In other words, the company can do stuff, and if someone sues the company, they don't get to have access to your money. You get to keep your money, all right? The company gets sued instead of you getting sued. And then the third thing is you can keep selling little pieces of your company to raise money, and that's called stock, all right? So when you buy some stock in a company, you own a piece of that company, all right? And you can buy stock in huge companies and be a part owner of Apple or Disney or Google, okay, or Ford Motor Company or Coca-Cola, all right? And basically what this does is for people that own the stock, when the company does well, the stock price goes up and they get richer too. Right? So this allows companies to become much larger, and it allows the risk to be deferred onto the company. People don't have to worry about losing all their money in lawsuits and things. And so now the modern corporations are basically owned by many, many, many people. And the corporation, they can actually share the profits. This is the neat thing, but not the debt. So if the corporation borrows a lot of money to expand, but they also, in that 1 year that they expanded, make a lot of money, they can split the profits out and share those to the stockholders, but the stockholders don't have to take on the debt. That belongs to the corporation itself. All right, so a lot of key benefits to this modern thing called a corporation. A lot of stuff that we do today wouldn't be possible with a traditional mom and pop or what we call an individual proprietorship operation. Then soon these corporations expand and they're all over the globe. And those are called international corporations or conglomerates. Okay? And once corporations, they become their own entities, like any other entity, they want to grow. And so they did what we've talked about. They start to acquire other companies, either they merge with them, or they buy them out, or they run them out of business, or they have what are called hostile takeovers, where they just, once you've issued stock, you can't control who buys it. So someone who wants your company, if they have enough money, they can just buy 51% of the stock, and they now own your company. Right? So corporations keep growing and growing, and this has both benefits and problems that we'll look at on Friday. Well, that's the US. Europe, Western Europe, is going to follow the same pattern pretty much. Now, remember, at the end of chapter 7, while Britain is industrializing, okay, Europe has to deal with the French Revolution and the wars of Napoleon. So they have all of this major sort of trauma and conflict that's keeping them from advancing. But eventually, at the Congress of Vienna, that gets settled, right? And then we get in the Low Countries the beginning of industry outside of Britain, all right? So first we have Belgium, right? And Belgium, on a very small scale, has all that stuff that Britain and the US have. They have the raw materials, they have the navigable rivers, okay? They have a great location, right in the middle of northwestern Europe. And so they begin to industrialize. And people like our buddy, Samuel Slater, I think it's Samuel Crompton, but a whole bunch of Samuel Slater types sneak out of Britain and smuggle in British ideas and build factories in Belgium and throughout Europe. The big story, though, with industrialization is going to be the creation of Germany. Now, there's always been Germans in Europe and a region called Germany, but there's not a country called Germany until this guy, Otto von Bismarck, takes all the little German states and puts them together into one country called Germany. And Germany's going to quickly become the most powerful country in Europe. Mm-hmm. And oops. And so by the middle of the 1800s, Germany, and again, you're going to see in this little graph we're going to look at, Germany is going to be rivaling and then surpassing Britain as an industrial power. And then basically when we get back from winter break, we're going to be smack dab in the middle of the First World War. And essentially that comes about because that old balance of power that we established after Napoleon, people can't figure out how to work this new super powerful Germany into that balance of power. And things get a little lopsided, and we're going to get a gigantic war with a very powerful industrialized Germany versus a very powerful industrialized Britain. And that's going to draw everybody else in. Right. Other places in Europe, right? Bohemia, which is modern day Czech Republic. Northern Italy becomes very industrialized and advanced. And they have mechanized production of luxury products like silk. Right? Now, France always remains things are slow today, sort of a mix of industrial production and agriculture. They still remain primarily a farming country, but they're very big and they have a huge population. So they still do quite well, even though they're sort of split between agriculture and industrialization. Next semester, when we get into the Great Depression, it doesn't hit France nearly as hard as Germany and Britain and the US because France is not as industrialized. So impacts, long-term impacts of this. Well, and again, you're going to see this when we look at the graph. We're going to get inequality between certain areas on planet Earth and other areas. And it's basically going to come down to who industrializes first. And that's going to create a wealth gap. And the countries that industrialize first, they're going to be the first ones to have big, powerful armies, big, powerful industries. And they're actually going to go and stop other places from industrializing so that they don't have to compete with them. And so essentially, Western Europe, the United States, and then in Asia, Japan industrializes, becomes very powerful. They will establish colonies. They'll take over smaller, less powerful places and essentially force them to participate in their economy. They'll come in and they'll take natural resources. from the colonies, and then they'll take them back to the home country and make finished goods, and then force the colonies to buy them. All right, we're not going to get to talk too much about imperialism just because we had such a short amount of time together this semester. But we're going to see an expansion of all the major powers. They're going to want to take places, because any place you take, whether in Africa, Asia, Central America, South America, it has raw materials you can use to make stuff. And then when you've made the stuff, it has populations of people that you can make buy the stuff. All right, so it's doubly beneficial for the imperial power. And then social transformation. Europe and the US will become powerful. Africa and Asia will lag behind, and they'll stay more agrarian, except in places where the colonial powers have instituted industry. Right? And then gradually the rest of the world will catch up. But if you look in the Western countries, Western Europe, Britain, the US, we're going to get the rise of that powerful industrial middle class, and they're going to take over sort of from the old class of kings, princes, nobles, things like that. The nation states will start to be run in the 19th century by middle class business people, and they will start to call for social reform and changes to try to make things better while we have the great expansion of industry. All right, and that's where we'll pick things up on Friday. And so let's go now and look over here. You have a copy of this graph. I'll show you in a second. But essentially, if we were all meeting together in school, I would give you just the raw data and you would plot this graph, but this is too problematic to do remotely. So I plotted it for you. So here we have 12, is it 12? 2, 3, 4, 10 nations, all right? And hopefully you can see the color differences. And so we have Great Britain, Belgium, the US, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Russia, and then China and India, all right? So we have the US, Western Europe, and then the two biggest non-European countries. And if you look at the bottom here, we're going to start at 1750, right when industrialization starts. And whatever data this is that we're collecting goes all the way till 1913, the eve of the First World War. And this is the main name of this chart is per capita industrialization. So in other words, what this is measuring, and we can talk about how, but it's basically the level of industrial output, industrial goods, industrial production per each person. So you take the total amount that they produced in 1 year divided by the number of people, and that gives you what's called per capita. That means per person, all right? And so you have, here's Britain, here's the US, here's Germany, Belgium, okay? You have all of these nations, and this is their output over this period of a little over 150 years. And what I want you to do is take this graph and turn it into a short paragraph of what you see. What do you see happening here? And I'll show you what you'll be looking at. And it looks a little better. I cleaned it up a little bit for you. So here's your copy of this. And basically below the line, just write a paragraph and some of the things you'll want to consider in your paragraph. You're turning this picture into a descriptive paragraph. What's being measured? What time period is being measured? Who's leading? What nations are doing the best at industrializing? Right? Which nations are going slower? And some nations that you'll see are even decreasing. And this is a really important part of the story. Why are some nations decreasing in industrialization as time goes on? It has to do with that imperialism that we talked about. Which nations have the most impressive rates of growth? You need to think back to your math classes, and we can see a lot of these nations have growth, but some of them finish in much higher spots. All right. What on the graph shows us how fast they're growing? What shows us not just whether or not there's growth, but how fast is the growth? All right. And then if this was for today, all right, look at these nations. Which nations do you think would be at the top today? Would it be the same or would it be different? Which nations would be the top industrial producers today? All right, so just a paragraph on that. And then there is the Chapter 9, Section 3 guided reading study guide to do as well. And so you have your Chapter 9 notes and your Chapter 9 textbook pages. And I'll put this video up there too. And then let me stop this.